Okay, so let's begin for the second part of this lecture on biophysical effects of land use and land cover changes. But just before, let's recap a little the major biophysical changes that land use provoke. Three major biophysical changes through the albedo, the roughness, and the evapotranspiration efficiency. We have seen that in general, when you deforest dark forest, then you have a brighter surface, more reflected sunlight, so cooler temperature. That's a radiative effect, a cooling effect, but you have also two other effects that tend to warm the surface relatively. When you cut a forest, then you decrease the roughness length, and then you decrease the capacity of the surface to exchange turbulent fluxes with the atmosphere. So you increase the surface temperature. And also, forests have efficient routes to extract soil moisture, which is not the case when you cut the forests. And then that leads to higher surface temperature. We have seen that the relative contribution of these biophysical changes are different among the latitudes. The predominant effect at boreal latitude is the albedo cooling due to deforestation. That dominates entirely the roughness and evapotranspiration efficiency changes, which leads to a small cooling effects over deforested area. And it's not the case around tropical deforested areas because albedo contrast is not so high. You don't have the snow mask effect as in boreal latitudes. And the roughness and evapotranspiration efficiency that are quite high in tropical forests dominates the albedo cooling. So you have this small warming effect due to deforestation. So let's see now, there was a question yesterday about, because I talk a lot about deforestation, but what about afforestation? And what is the net impact of northern hemisphere afforestation? So that's a study from Betts in Nature 2000 comparing the biogeochemical effect of afforestation, which leads to a higher carbon uptake, as we can see there in the top panel. So Betts put, I think, dense coniferous forest at each grid cell, so it gives more carbon uptake for boreal forest, for example. But you have a biogeophysical adverse effect, that is the decrease in albedo, because forests are dark. So what is the additive effect? What is the net impact of temperate afforestation? So it expressed that in terms of net global radiative forcing, albedo from one part, CO2 sequestration from the other part. And the yellow grid cells, orange and red, denotes positive net forcings. That implies that these regions, when you afforest, that cause a net warming. You have also some regions that experiment neutral effects of afforestation, so they are balanced, the carbon sequestration is balanced by the decrease in albedo, like Russian regions. And you have some regions that still see, like North America and Europe, some negative forcing, so cooling net impact of afforestation, but of course smaller than that expected from only if you take into account the biogeochemical effect. So this is why biogeophysical impacts are important to take into account. This is a summary of the existing literature of biophysical impacts of deforestation on temperature and precipitation. So that's a compilation I made on more than 40 modeling and observational studies among the regions. So we will go step by step. This part denotes the biophysical effects on both temperature and precipitation. If you have a boreal deforestation, if you have a temperate deforestation, if you have a tropical deforestation, if you have a global deforestation. And there you have the net effects, so the biophysical more the biogeochemical effects due to deforestation. So what's interesting is that in general the study agree that if you deforest the the boreal forests, you will have a cooling effect due to the albedo drastic increase with the snow globally. A small cooling in the case of temperate deforestation, which can be seen at global scale. But see that among 3 or 4 studies that made some tropical deforestation, you just have an unchanged or small, very small cooling globally on the temperature. Because you have a large increase of temperature regionally on the deforested area in the tropics, but it's balanced by the extratropical cooling in general. And for global scale deforestation, I showed, for example, the study of Davin and de Noblet, you still have a cooling global effect. If you add to this biophysical effect the biogeochemical effects, which is warming in general for deforestation, you lose carbon sequestration possibility. For boreal, it's not so high because boreal forests have not so high carbon content compared to tropical forests that really increase the temperature. So the net effect, the felt effects of a tropical deforestation at present day would be on global temperature a warming, whereas we will have a global cooling for boreal deforestation. We still don't know for temperate. It depends on how you define temperate regions, which band of latitude also. Now for regional aspects, so what is the impact of boreal deforestation on boreal regions? You still have the cooling because of the albedo dramatic increase. For tropical areas, when you deforest, especially the Amazon, not so Africa or southern Asia, you have really good increase that is enhanced with the net biogeochemical effect, so you can reach some 2 degrees locally on additive on annual mean temperature regionally. For precip now, you can see that there is a lot of interrogations because we don't know, it's model dependent, whether the precip globally are modified or not. It seems that in general, when you cut forests globally, boreal, temperate, etc., you reduce the evapotranspiration efficiency of all the previous forests then. And so you have less atmospheric water vapor in the atmosphere, so less probability to form precipitation. This is why, in general, we have this minus sign, so less precipitation, both globally and regionally. When you had the small warming due to biogeochemical effect, then it's or unchanged or unknown, except for tropical regions where you have drying. It's here in blue, but it's reduction of precipitation regionally. So tropical deforestation leads to warmer and drier regional climates. Okay, so I've just seen some experiments, observational studies also on deforestation, afforestation. But what about the existing, the experimented land use and land cover change in the past decades? What is the biophysical impacts of these land use and land cover changes? And we will see after how the future land use and land cover changes will impact the temperature through biophysical impacts. So to study the biophysical of historical land use and land cover change, you need to isolate the land use impact of the past century, because you have simulation with land use, with volcanic eruption, with solar irradiance changes, with CO2 increase. And what basically the LULCC intercomparison exercise made is asking a lot of global coupled models to make simulation without land use. And then the difference with and without land use will give you the contribution of the historical land use and land cover change. So have you seen, you maybe have seen the crop and pasture fraction difference simulated here between 1992 and 1870. We have a large increase in crop and pasture fraction and a large decrease in forest fraction, especially in North America and in Eurasia. So these are the results for 7 models in lines for the impact of historical land use and land cover changes on latent heat flux, on surface temperature, and on the third column is precipitation. So for the first column, we see that we have both red pixel that denote decrease in latent heat flux, and some models with blue pixel denoting increase in latent heat flux. So we have a large uncertainty among the models, among the LULCC models, concerning the evapotranspiration changes due to land use and land cover changes. For the temperature now, we, in general, except maybe for this IPSL model, most models agree on blue pixels, so cooling effect due to past land use and land cover change in the last century. And for precipitation, where very few pixels are significant, and we both have red pixel, blue pixel, so no clear signal for precipitation. We seem to have a signal for temperature. So now when we compare the global values of temperature due to biophysical land use and land cover changes of the past century, for each model, we have a cooling effect of, on average, minus 0.02 degrees. If we compare it to the CO2 emissions that lead to a warming, on the past century, it's more about 0.4 degrees. So that's one order of magnitude less for the biophysical impacts of land use and land cover change of the past century for global temperature. That means that the trends in global warming for the past century were slightly reduced of at maximum 10% due to the land use and land cover changes globally. Now, regionally, if we make the same exercise for surface temperature, comparing land use and land cover changes here with dark gray boxes for the North America region at each season, and we compare this biophysical impact of land use and land cover change with the warming due to CO2 and SST, sea surface temperature increase, we have in fact comparable impacts regionally on temperature. So biophysical impacts are as much as important as CO2 increase on temperature. Now what's interesting on this figure is also the large spread between the models. So they try to attribute in this paper and in others the large spread on temperature simulated. A first possibility is because that the implementation of natural vegetation for each model is different. The implementation of non-crop and pasture map are different. That leads to different land cover maps for each model, and in absolute value you have differences in forest extent simulated by each model. Look at, for example, for EC-Earth model that simulates for the past land use and land cover change minus 40% in North America forest extent, whereas for ECAM5 it's only maybe minus 10%. So that contributes to the model spread we saw on temperature. A second thing is the low agreement among the lucid models concerning the changes in the partitioning of latent and sensible heat flux. So we see there for each model the changes in latent heat flux normalized, so per forest fraction changes. So for a given fraction of forest change, we have, for example, this model that displays no sensitivity to land use and land cover change, just a small decrease in latent heat flux. We have this model with a moderate sensitivity, but that simulates an increase in latent heat flux when you deforest, which is not the intuitive paradigm. And this one, IPSL, a very large sensitivity to land use and land cover change that simulates a latent heat flux, decrease when the grassland are increasing. So you have a large diversity of models with large diversity of sensitivity of evapotranspiration changes due to land use and land cover change. That can explain the spread in temperature simulated. Okay, I didn't talk about the urbanization impacts on climate that can also, when you have urbanized area, we saw it for the water cycle, for example, with less infiltration, we have a lot of biophysical changes. So you can think that there is an impact of urbanization on temperature changes. In fact, we denote the urban heat island as the relative warmth of a city compared to surrounding rural areas. And the biophysical changes due to urbanization depend, of course, on the replaced land cover. If before you had crops or you had natural vegetation. You increase the surface runoff. You have more heat retention, mostly because of the concrete. So high sensible heat flux and absolutely low evapotranspiration. You have also changes in albedo, so it has to be studied. And in general, what we see is that you have a strong local warming from 2 to more than 6 degrees, depending on the size of the city and the greenness of the city. But if you look at a global scale, here we have the trends in temperature at rural station in green from the past decades. So we see the warming. And in brown, we have the same trends in temperature at urban stations. And we see very little difference. So there is almost no impact of urbanization on global warming trends. On the past decade, we can see that in urban areas, we have a very slight warming here. The brown curve is above. Of course, we can think about some mitigations for these strong local warming effects, like white roofs. I don't present it there, but white roofs, it's increase the albedo, so it's decrease the temperature in surface. And we can also think of greener cities, so green areas, forests in the cities. And in general, the prevailing paradigm is that you have, when you increase the greenness, as here, EVI, it's an index of greenness, you decrease the daytime temperature in the city, and quite strongly. So the prevailing paradigm is that the greener, the cooler for the urban heat island. Now, I talked about effects on temperature and precipitation due to land use and land cover change, but what about wind energy or wind turbines? Are they affected by the roughness changes due to deforestation or to afforestation? So that's a study from Votar et al. In Nature Geoscience 2010, showing that over the past 30 years, here it's the trend in wind speed in meter per second per decade, we have blue spots that denotes a decreasing trend of northern hemisphere wind speeds of about 10%. And they try to attribute this decreasing trend in northern hemisphere wind speeds due to roughness length. So they looked at meteorological stations, and when the NDVI was available for spring summer, so an index of vegetation contents, you see that when you increase the NDVI, you decrease the wind speed trends. So you have you have less wind in general when you increase the vegetation. So that's completely consistent with the increasing roughness that reduced the wind speed. And that's also what denote this modeling experiment of simulated 10-meter wind speed anomalies due to an increase of 50% of the roughness parameter in the MM5 regional model in the Eurasian region. So you have blue, it denotes the reduction of wind speed due to deforestation, and especially in Russia, but also Europe and China. So that's a concern of afforestation, reforestation, deforestation also. Let's see now what are the biophysical impacts of future land use and land cover changes. Davin et al. In Journal 2007 made one IPSL simulations to see the impact of historical, so on the left part, historical land use and land cover change on temperature and on future. What we see is that we have still this past cooling effect of land use, and it seems to be a little increased, especially over North America and Russia, with this strong warming due to the scenario of tropical Amazon deforestation. So still a cooling. But that's one model. There was also this LULCC SEMI5 experiment. So it's basically the same as LULCC, but for the future. using 6 semi-5 models with the scenario RCP 8.5, and so simulation with and without land use and land cover change for the future. And these are the results there in the second column for changes in surface air temperature. So in general, the simulated biophysical and net effects of future land use change are globally not significant, both for temperature but also for precipitation. Some regions, of course, with more than 10% of land use and land cover change for the future have significant, but it's not robust, the changes among the models. We can have higher signals for regional patterns or extremes, for example, for hot extremes. So this is a talkative picture from Nathalie Denoblé, showing the potential relative roles of biophysical versus the biogeochemical effects you saw with Joe of land use and land cover changes. So at global scale now, the biogeophysical effects are quite balanced with the biogeochemical effects. At regional scale, they can have really strong effects nowadays. The land use is dominating, in some cases, the warming trend due to CO2. But in future, the biogeochemical effects remains stronger. But for regional study, it's still as much as important as biogeochemical impacts for the future. I will show now some more specific decisions of land use change for climate mitigation. So, for example, the tillage effects can change biophysical property, as you can see in this photo of a non-tilled field here in green, and a tilled field which is, as you can see, darker. So you see immediately there is absolutely no change in roughness length, or very few. So the major change in biophysical property is really the albedo. So what is the impact of the tillage in Europe? This is a study, a recent study from Davin et al. In Nature Climate Change in 2014. And this is exactly what we see there in the curve. In blue we have no tillage, so this field. And we see that with tillage we have a darker albedo, so low albedo of with a difference of 0.1. So what is the impact on temperature due to tillage? In fact, here it's the impact of if you don't practice the tillage in whole Europe, and you have a cooling effect due to the practice of non-tillage, and especially for the highest percentile of Tmax. So it can really inhibit substantially heat waves development, for example, or hot extremes locally. Another specific decision that took place in Florida in 1993, where they decided to plant lemon crops, sugarcane and winter wheat in Florida because they were thinking that it's warmer, so it will be good for the crops. But of course you modify the land use and the land cover. So what happens locally? They wanted to avoid devastating freezes, so here it's the vegetation predominating in the at the beginning of the century. So with a lot of forests, with swamps also. And after the decision in 1993, so in yellow, all the crops, and they drained the swamps also. So Marshall et al. In Nature 2003 studied with a atmospheric regional model the effect of this land use change, making a simulation post 1993 and minus pre 1993. And oops, because what we see there is the temperature changes after the decision, and we have a cooling effect around the drained swamps with an increase in the duration of frozen days. So that's the frozen length period. So that's completely leads to the contrary of what they previously thought. Why? Because with natural swamps we have a minimum of evaporation flux. This evaporation leads to a moistening of the boundary layer, and this atmospheric water vapor is a greenhouse gas. So it in this column, the presence of the water vapor seemed to avoid temperatures to go below 0 degree when you had swamps. So with modeling studies, this is typically the decisions you can assess, and maybe these adverse effects could have been prevented. Irrigation effects. So irrigation drastically increased in the past century, with especially in Asia, where you concentrate 70% of irrigated areas in the world. So Puma and Cook in GJR 2010 tested the effects of irrigation, the impact of irrigation at global scale on the surface temperature. So here it's only for summer, and we see that we have a summer cooling due to the fact that with irrigation you provide more water to the soil, you have more annual evaporation, precipitation and cloud cover increase, and in general you have less annual sensible heat flux that warms the surface. So you have this cooling effect. You can also think about the water management effects, especially in Europe. This is a study we made in 2012. That's an observational study for the 60 past years, where you have here the percentage of hot days in continental Europe in function of an index of the soil moisture contained in soil at the beginning of the summer. So for the black spots, it's only for southern soil moisture in Europe. You see that when you have high soil moisture at the beginning of the summer, you have low hot days, so you inhibit heat waves. Whereas for low content of soil moisture at the beginning of the summer, you can reach high temperature and lead to heat wave in 2003, for example. Here it's this point. That's not the case if you deal with northern moisture, because you can increase it. It does not lead to a decrease in the percentage of hot days in continental Europe. So if you focus on southern Europe and the water management there, that can have an impact on European heat waves at the continental scale. There is also in the same line the study of Tulling et al. In Nature Geoscience 2010 at site level, so that's the pairwise sites between grassland and forest, non-distant sites. And they monitored the sensible heat flux, the latent heat flux, etc. And for the heat wave of 2003, for example, they monitored the changes in time of the sensible heat flux. And we see that at short term of the heat wave, the forests increases the temperature because it's darker. So this is why you have a sensible heat flux that is higher. Still, when you have enough soil moisture. But after, at a certain threshold, you can reach dramatic increase in sensible influx in the case of grassland because of the soil moisture depletion. But forest, you can see that the sensible influx is more constant. So in the long term of a heat wave, forest can mitigate the impact of most extreme heat waves. And we see it also there for the temperature increase in grassland areas during the heat waves. You have plus 2 degrees in the grassland. So the forest can inhibit a little the effects of the extreme heat waves in Europe. You can also think of more geoengineering stuff, like having strong albedo crops, brighter crops. And this is what Rigel et al. In 2009 simulated with a global coupled model. And in fact, if we have brighter crops almost everywhere in the northern hemisphere, then you can reduce the top albedo, and that can lead to a 1 degree reduction in summer regionally. That's, they say, less expensive than carbon sequestration, but it implies, according to the authors, a massive genetic modification and selective breeding. And this is maybe a figure that Sebastian will describe in more details this afternoon. That's a paper of him in Nature Climate Change in 2014, saying that basically the biophysical effects of temperate land management, that is defined as human soil, water, vegetation treatment, use of fertilizers, species introduction, etc., is as much as important as land cover changes. So in tens of nearby temperate sites with different land management, they found that in temperate regions you have land management changes and land cover changes that are with the same magnitude. So a small summary of other biophysical impacts of land use and land cover changes. So wind speed, we saw that it's probably reduced with afforestation and urbanization. So you have also recent study on this. It's largely unknown in general. It seems to have higher signal for temperature extreme. For example, Pittman et al. Claimed that there is a significant decrease in highest percentile of Tmax, so in heat waves, due to the historical land use and land cover change. Tulling and other authors say that the forest can mitigate the mid-latitude heat waves because of more water conservations. And for the cloudiness, there was a question yesterday. The bunny fence experiment in Australia seemed to show that there is more cloudiness above forests, but that's not always the case, because you can have small clearings with high content of cloudiness. Let's think about small clearings with surrounding tropical forest, for example. You will have low pressure in surface because you have large sensible heat flux, high temperature. So that will favor advection from surrounding areas. You will have like a column like that. And if you have tropical forests with lot of soil moisture, with lot of moisture, you have an advection of moisture around the clearings. So you will have more cloudiness. That's the cold vegetation breeze phenomenon. You have more cloudiness above clearings. So for cloudiness, it has to be investigated a little more. Bullet points for the last slides. So biophysical impacts of deforestation, you have to take into account the 3 biophysical changes due to deforestation. Because forests are dark, so it implies albedo. Forests are transparent, they imply evapotranspiration efficiency, and rough, so that implies roughness length. In general, tropical deforestation leads to warmer and drier regional climate because the albedo small cooling effect is dominated by the large changes in evapotranspiration efficiency, because tropical forests are really high LI, they are really good to evaporate, and this warming is dominating. For boreal deforestation, that leads to cooler climate in general, because the contrast in albedo is dominating the small warming of due to evaporation and roughness changes. Biophysical impacts are small globally, but they are as large as biogeochemical effects regionally. So they have to be taken into account in every afforestation project. For the net impacts of historical and future land use and land cover change, so biophysical more biogeochemical, in general, most models agree on a small global cooling effect due to the deforestation of the past century that lead to maximum 10% of decreasing warming trend. In general, no signal for the precipitation, and there is still this large uncertainty concerning evapotranspiration changes due to deforestation. For future land use and land cover changes, of course, it depends on the scenario, what we will do. But globally, the net impact is not so significant for the moment among the model, both for temperature and precipitation. But the regional effects can be higher than that. So thanks a lot.